Can you imagine? No one touched me. No bullet hit me. But the bone inside my thigh is making a sound like a cork that won't fit into a bottle. Right in front of me, about 5 meters away, there was a rusty iron basement door. Behind that door was nothing but pitch black. I looked down at the ground. My shadow should have been lying obediently beneath me. But instead, that black shadow was being dragged by a hand reaching out from the crack of that iron door. What kind of hand was that? It was thicker than a normal person's thigh. Completely hairless, pitch black skin stretched over bone. It looked like a black twisted rope made of several rusty steel bars tightly wound together, with joint skin folds as thick as tires. Even scarier, its fingers were bent backward toward the back of the hand. That black hand with reversed joints was now gripping my shadow's neck tightly, pulling it into the dark crack of the door. With every pull, my physical body slid forward across the ground. The gravel on the ground shredded my camouflage pants, burning with pain. Then from the basement came a dull thud of something heavy hitting the iron door. Thump! The sound was heavy, like a big rock smashing into dead pork. With that loud noise, the black hand suddenly jerked back. The shadow on the ground was yanked in a large chunk. Immediately after, my right leg joint made a sharp cracking sound, and my entire kneecap visibly twisted outward. The pain was like someone using pliers to forcibly twist my joint 180 degrees. "Ah, help! Pull me!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. My teammate in the corner heard my cry and was desperately crawling toward me. Dust flew in the air, making me cough. The rusty iron door moved again, its hinges making a teeth-grinding sound. The crack grew wider, revealing nothing but dead blackness behind it, and from inside came the sound of bones grinding against each other, crackling. With every sound, my body slid another big step toward that dark abyss. Before things turned out like this, we were just a small squad on a routine patrol in the ruins. This place had been bombed repeatedly by planes a few days ago, with collapsed buildings everywhere. Broken concrete chunks were everywhere. The sun hung directly overhead, baking the ground like a giant frying pan. The 5 of us walked in a line, rifles resting on our shoulders, stepping over the broken bricks one by one. The sound of boots on stones echoed far through the empty streets. It was too quiet here. No wind, no birds, not even a fly. Normally, bombed ruins should smell of smoke from a big fire. But here there was only a strange, sticky smell like rotten wood from a stagnant ditch. As I walked, I wiped sweat from my eyes with my sleeve. Then I noticed something very strange. There were many small stones, scattered by the explosions on the roadside. The sun was overhead, so the shadows of those stones should have been right beneath them, right? But when I looked down, I saw that all those small black shadows were uniformly tilted to the right. They were all stretching to the right, as if something in the crack of the right wall was sucking them in. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I reached out and tugged at Pete, who was walking in front of me. "Pete, look at the stones on the ground." Pete stopped and looked where I was pointing. He paused too, then reached out with his boot to kick one of the stones. The stone rolled a few times on the ground and stopped 2 meters away. Strangely, no matter how the stone rolled, as soon as it stopped, its shadow would, within a tenth of a second, point back to the right direction. The captain up front signaled for us to shut up. He pointed to an alley entrance ahead. It was a dead end, flanked by 2 half-collapsed gray high-rises. At the deepest part of the alley, there was a cast-iron basement door, covered in red rust, with chains lying on the ground. The captain led us into this dead end. The sunlight made the concrete ground in the alley blindingly white. Suddenly, the captain's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. He stood frozen as if poured in cement, his eyes fixed on the ground, his lips starting to tremble. "Don't move. Everyone don't move." The captain's voice was low, carrying a frightening tremor. We all stopped and looked down where the captain was staring. The shadows of the 5 of us, at this very moment, were not obediently following at our feet. They lay limp on the ground like 5 black plastic strips, stretched extremely long. Even stranger, no matter how we stood, all 5 shadows were neatly spread flat on the ground, their tips pointing rigidly at the rusty iron door at the end of the alley. I tried to take a small step back with my left foot. My boot did step on a piece of broken brick behind me, but the black shadow of my foot on the ground stayed where it was. It had completely separated from my soul. My real foot was behind. The shadow's foot was in front, with a bare stretch of concrete in between. Not only that, but the hands of Pete's shadow started moving on their own on the ground. In reality, Pete's hands were gripping his rifle tightly, but the black shadow on the ground raised both hands, fingers spread wide, pointing at the basement iron door, making a gesture as if trying to grab the doorknob. The surroundings were dead silent. Only the heat from the sun baking the ground distorted the air. From behind that rusty basement iron door, there suddenly came a particularly dull scraping sound, as if some heavy bones were slowly crawling across the rough ground. After that dull sound, Pete was completely terrified. He let out a distorted scream, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and turned to run out of the alley. His feet kicked up a cloud of dust as he pushed off the ground, but just as his body lunged forward half a step, something strange happened. His feet were clearly pushing forward, but his whole body seemed to hit an invisible rubber wall and was bounced back with a thud. I watched Pete's black shadow on the ground. It was still nailed to the spot, the shadow of his feet as if riveted to the concrete with giant iron nails. Pete's real feet ran forward, but the shadow on the ground pulled backward. This bizarre tug-of-war lasted only half a second. Then a crack came from Pete's right calf. The sound was especially loud, like someone snapping a large dry branch with their bare hands. Pete's body twisted, and he fell to the ground with a slap. He clutched his right thigh, rolling desperately on the ground, screaming loudly. I looked down at his leg. His pant leg was rubbing on the ground, and the bone inside had pushed the camouflage pants into a sharp bulge. His entire foot twisted backward. "Help me! My shadow is being stepped on." Pete crawled on the ground, clawing at the cracks in the concrete with his hands. At that moment, the rusty basement iron door at the end of the alley let out a loud bang. It was the sound of metal being violently struck, and red rust fell like rain. The door gap was suddenly forced open into a half-meter wide black slit. Then that black monstrous hand, covered in thick wrinkles with joints bending backward, reached out from inside. It didn't grab Pete's clothes or his boots. Its broad black palm in the sunlight slapped down onto the head of Pete's shadow. The moment that monstrous hand pressed the shadow, Pete's whole body was as if hit by a truck going full speed. His upper body jerked backward, and the back of his head slammed hard into the ground, smashing the broken bricks into dust. "Shoot! Shoot now!" the captain shouted as he raised his rifle and frantically pulled the trigger at the iron door. Rat-tat-tat! Rat-tat-tat! Bullets sprayed from the muzzle one after another, with red flashes. The bullets hit the iron door, punching small holes through the metal, sparks flying everywhere. Some bullets hit that pitch-black monstrous hand, but no red blood came out. The bullets sank into the flesh, making only dull sounds like hitting dead pork. Thud, thud, thud. From each bullet hole oozed a black, shiny, viscous liquid, looking just like waste oil leaking from a car engine. The liquid dripped onto the ground, giving off pungent white smoke that sizzled on the concrete. But that hand didn't care about the bullets at all. It grabbed Pete's shadow and began to pull it back into the iron door. Pete's body struggled desperately on the ground, his hands scratching white nail marks into the concrete. His bulletproof vest scraped against the ground, making a harsh rustling sound. As the monstrous hand pulled back, Pete's left thigh also gave a crisp crack. Both his legs were now bent at odd angles, like a broken plastic doll. Sam couldn't take it anymore either. He stepped forward, rifle in hand, shouting as he aimed at the black hand. "Go to hell, you monster." Sam emptied an entire magazine. His bullets deformed one of the monster hand's fingers, leaving it hanging limp, black oil spraying out like a fountain. But because Sam took a step forward, his shadow shifted along with him. Right at that moment, a second black arm reached out from behind the iron door. This arm was even longer than the first, its skin like patches of dead fish scales stuck together, rough and bumpy. It swept across the ground fast, grabbing Sam's shadow right at the waist. Sam's yell cut off instantly. His stomach visibly caved inward, as if an invisible thick rope had wrapped around his midsection. His feet lifted half a meter off the ground, and with a loud smack, he flew sideways. His back slammed into the red brick wall nearby, causing the already cracked surface to crumble loudly. Large chunks of broken brick crashed onto his helmet, denting it badly. "Fall back. Everyone to the corner. Stay out of the sun." The captain grabbed me by the collar of my bulletproof vest and yanked me backward. My right leg was throbbing so badly I couldn't put any weight on it. My shadow was still being pulled by the first monster hand, and my right knee dragged backward across the ground. The gravel on the floor pressed hard against my joint, and every movement felt like someone scraping a knife across my bone. I crawled backward using my hands, watching the scene on the ground. Pete's voice was getting weaker. Most of his body had already been dragged to the rusty iron door. His hand still gripped the door's edge, trying to hold himself steady. But from the pitch-black darkness behind the door, a row of white, gleaming things suddenly appeared. They weren't teeth. They were several sharp white bones growing in reverse. Those bones reached out from the dark crack in the door, like giant clamps, and locked onto the shoulders of Pete's shadow. In reality, a terrible sound of bones cracking came from Pete's shoulders. His shoulders collapsed inward, and his whole body twisted into a strange shape. Then, an enormous pulling force came from inside the iron door. Bang! Pete slid completely across the ground and into the dark shadow of the rusty iron door. From inside came a sticky, dragging sound, like something being pulled through mud, along with the clatter of bones hitting the floor one joint at a time. Sam was lying in the pile of collapsed bricks, his face covered in dust, his rifle dropped to the side. White foam was coming out of his mouth, both hands clutching his stomach, his body curled up like a cooked shrimp. His shadow was now mixed in with the shadows of the fallen bricks in the corner, and the monster seemed unable to pinpoint his exact location among the tangled shadows. The captain and I finally made it behind a thick load-bearing wall. Above us, a half-collapsed concrete slab from the second floor formed a small awning, completely blocking the sunlight overhead. I lay in the shadow, gasping for air, my chest heaving like a bellows. Sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't dare wipe it. I just stared at the iron door not far away. That rusty iron door was now half open. The first monster hand and the second were slowly retreating back into the dead darkness. The black oil on the ground still gave off a foul smell, white smoke drifting in the sunlight. Silence fell again. Only the sun still blazed overhead. From the dark crack in the door, two strange points of light suddenly flickered to life. They were a sickly green, like the eyes of dead fish buried deep in a chest cavity, peering through the crack, searching for the three of us still alive, one by one in the blinding white sunlight. The three of us were now all huddled under that collapsed concrete slab. The shadow here was large and cool, wrapping us completely. Outside, the sun was still merciless, shining on the pile of rubble nearby, reflecting a blinding white light. The rusty basement iron door sat motionless, the crack pitch black. The two green dead fish eyes seemed to have closed, and there was no sound from inside. The captain lay beside me, his back pressed against the thick concrete load-bearing wall. He was breathing heavily, pulling a black smoke grenade from a small pocket on his tactical vest. His fingers were covered in dust, and his hand trembled slightly as he yanked the pin. Fizz with a soft hiss. Streams of hot white smoke billowed out of the smoke grenade. The captain raised his hand and tossed it out into the sunlight. Thick clouds of white smoke quickly spread, forming a dense wall that completely separated us from the rusty iron door. Now, the sunlight outside was thoroughly blocked by the white smoke. Without direct light, the scattered gravel shadows on the ground blurred into a vast gray haze. It looks like as long as there's no light, that monster's claws can't find our shadows, the captain said in a low voice, patting me and Sam on the shoulders. Sam lay in a pile of bricks, his complexion looking a bit better than before. At least he wasn't foaming at the mouth anymore. He pressed his hand hard against his stomach, gritting his teeth, and slowly dragged himself toward us. His combat boots scraped against the ground, making a rustling sound. Yeah, this has to be some kind of physical interference. As long as we stay in this dark room without direct sunlight, it can't yank our bones from a distance. Sam grunted as he picked up the rifle that had fallen beside him. Around us, nothing stirred except the white smoke drifting after the danger had passed. The black waste oil sludge on the ground had stopped smoking. It seemed the crisis was temporarily over, and everyone's heartbeat steadied a bit. But as I lay on the ground, staring at the collapsed concrete slab above us, I suddenly noticed some highly unusual details. Logically, it was afternoon, and the sun was slowly moving westward. Yet the faint light seeping through the cracks in the rubble on either side of us wasn't shifting with the sun's position. I looked down at a small piece of concrete debris near my boot. In the dim light, it cast a faint gray shadow. That shadow wasn't stretching eastward with the sun outside. Instead, it was slowly shortening on the concrete floor, like a living worm. It wasn't just this debris shadow. I turned to look at Sam. He was leaning against the wall, his bulletproof vest casting a faint outline on the wall. The edges of that outline now sprouted tiny, fuzzy black branches. Those black branches were like countless fine black hairs, creeping one by one up the cracks in the concrete wall. They moved slowly, silently, without making a sound. The strange smell of stagnant water and rotten wood in the air grew stronger, and on the originally dry load-bearing wall, black beads of water began to appear, glistening as they trickled down the plaster, leaving sticky black streaks. The black hairs crawling up the wall cracks moved faster and faster. They converged on the concrete wall, twisting together densely into black shadows as thick as fingers. Suddenly, a particularly harsh scraping sound came from above us. Creak-it was the sound of something heavy dragging across the concrete slab. The half-collapsed slab above us began to shed debris, and large flakes of gray concrete dust fell onto my helmet. By now, the sun had sunk lower, and its slanting rays bypassed the white smoke outside, cutting through the broken window paper and angling into the abandoned store. The light created countless thick beams inside the building. As the beams appeared, the tables, chairs, and broken concrete pillars in the room all cast long black shadows on the floor. Sam was still leaning against the corner, and the slanting light hit his shoulder. His shadow stretched huge across the white wall, motionless, pressed into the brick gaps. Just then, at the top of the concrete slab above us, large patches of shadow suddenly began to move on their own. They didn't follow the direction of the light. Instead, they gathered together, forming a massive black silhouette with countless monstrous, reverse-jointed hands. That dark figure crawled rapidly across the ceiling. With its movements, the concrete floor above began to groan under the immense weight. Boom! A section of concrete beam as thick as a wash basin was snapped off, crashing to the ground and shattering. A massive physical entity, following the path of that shadow, forced its way through the broken hole in the second floor. It was an indescribably massive creature. Its head sat right in the middle of its chest, with no nose or ears, only two green, dead fish eyes. On either side of its body were a dozen thick limbs twisted like black steel rebar, each jointed backward, flexing and extending through the air. It stood on a collapsed wall, brutally shoving the remaining red brick walls down in whole sections. It didn't touch Sam on the ground. Its strange head, embedded in its chest, lowered, and its two green eyes locked onto Sam's shadow on the wall. Then, one of the creature's black rebar-like limbs swept through the air, and its solid claw slammed with pinpoint accuracy onto the neck of Sam's shadow on the wall. Thud. A dull sound. Sam's real body, with nothing touching it, jerked its neck backward. The back of his skull pressed flat against the hard wall. His entire body seemed nailed to the wall by an invisible giant spike. "Captain, it's on the wall. It's grabbing the shadow on the wall." Sam twisted desperately, his hands clawing at the air. The skin on his neck stretched tight and pale from the immense pull. The captain raised his gun and sprayed bullets wildly at the creature's body on the ceiling. Rat-tat-tat. 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 Bullets with long tongues of fire struck the creature's chest one after another. Its flesh was torn apart like dead pork, black goo like waste oil splattering everywhere, staining the surrounding floor and walls black. But the creature didn't flinch at all from the gunfire. The shell casings clinked sharply on the concrete floor. Because the muzzle kept spitting blinding flashes, the dim, abandoned store began to flicker with high-frequency light. Every time the gunfire flashed, the shadows of me and the captain stretched long and sharp across the walls and floor. The creature seemed drawn to these suddenly elongated, clear shadows. Its head set in its chest turned, and its green eyes looked at our shadows. Its dozen wrinkled, backward-jointed black claws began to flail wildly through the air, each swing carrying a heavy whoosh. Boom! A broken wall was smashed to dust by its claw, countless brick fragments, and gravel raining down like hail on my bulletproof vest. As it moved, the shadows of tables and chairs on the floor were shattered, and the building's internal load-bearing structure crumbled like a child's sandcastle under its brute force. Sam was still struggling on the wall, his shadow pinned by another of the creature's claws. His waist was being pressed into the wall at a bizarre angle, the steel plates in his vest already deforming, groaning under the strain. My waist is about to snap. Pull me up." Sam's voice had become very weak. His 10 fingers dug into the brick gaps, his nails filled with black mud and blood. By now, the sun outside had completely dipped near the horizon. Massive swaths of blood-red light poured through the gaps in the ruins, stretching the shadows in the store even thicker and longer than before. Those black shadows in the blood-red light writhed wildly across the floor and walls like giant, living pythons. The creature let out a heavy, raspy breath like an old bellows. Its massive body moved slowly across the broken concrete beams, each backward-jointed black claw scraping deep white marks into the rough concrete surface. The remaining large concrete slabs on the roof began to give way, along with countless rusted rebar, falling inch by inch. The captain kept mechanically pulling the trigger, but the rifle's firing pin clicked empty. Click. The magazine was empty. The muzzle flash vanished instantly, leaving only the blood-red setting sun outside. The creature's dozen black, backward-jointed claws slowly spread in the shadows. A dozen fingers bent backward, grasping and closing in the air. Its dead fish eyes, set in its chest, locked onto the 2 black shadows of me and the captain on the ground, through the swirling gray dust. Click. The empty click of the captain's rifle was especially sharp in the dead-silent room. He yanked the bolt back, but nothing came out. The magazine was truly empty. He tossed the rifle aside and fumbled frantically over his tactical vest. His fingers trembled, tearing at the pouches, but he had no spare full magazines left. Nothing. No more bullets. The captain screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice as shrill as a chicken being choked by the neck. He suddenly lurched backward, slamming his back hard against the broken wall behind him. Then, kicking his feet wildly on the ground, he swung the empty rifle in his hands like a club, thrashing it at the sunlight slanting through the air ahead, making it whoosh with each swing. Over by the corner, Sam had completely fallen apart. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot like a red fishing net. He gave up trying to grip the cracks in the wall and instead reached down to his thigh, pulling out a gleaming tactical knife. He didn't stab at the monster on the ceiling. Instead, he pressed the blade firmly toward the direction of his own shadow, letting out a beastly howl. "Let me go. Let go of my shadow. Get off." As he screamed, Sam stabbed wildly at the writhing black tendrils on the ground. Thump, thump, thump. The knife tip slammed into the hard concrete floor, sending up bursts of white sparks. He was using too much force. The tip snapped off on the concrete, and a shard of steel flew up, slicing a long gash across his own face. But the shadow on the ground wasn't afraid of the knife. Those black, hairy tendrils kept climbing up the wall, already tightly wrapped around the shadow of Sam's entire right arm. Then a crisp sound of bone dislocation came from Sam's real right arm. His shoulder joint visibly popped upward, and his entire right arm instantly drooped like a limp noodle. The knife clattered onto the pile of broken bricks. Sam grabbed his right shoulder with his left hand, smashing his head against the wall on the ground until his forehead split open, dust and blood streaming down in thick rivulets. At that moment, the monster on the ceiling began to crawl down. Its dozen or so black, reverse-jointed claws, thick with tire-like folds, gripped the broken concrete beams one after another. Boom! Another crumbling brick wall collapsed under its belly, countless large red bricks raining down around me and the captain. One brick landed squarely on the captain's boot, crushing his toes out of shape, but he couldn't even scream. He just scrambled backward on the ground, clawing muddy streaks mixed with black oil into the floor. The two dead fish eyes inside the monster's chest shifted, and then one of its thick black limbs whipped through the air. Bang! That reverse-jointed black claw slammed solidly onto the concrete floor, landing right on the shadow of the captain's thigh. In that instant, the captain's entire left leg twisted grotesquely to the side. His kneecap popped outward, the big bone inside straining against his camouflage pants, nearly tearing through the fabric. The captain crashed face first onto the ground, his hands digging into the concrete cracks, his eyes bulging from the sheer agony, almost popping out of their sockets. His mouth gaped wide, but only a wheezing, leaking sound came from his throat. The monster pulled on the captain's shadow, slowly dragging it toward its chest. The captain's body slid backward across the floor, his vest scraping against the rough concrete with a teeth-grinding screech. Gravel on the ground scraped his cheek raw, leaving a long trail of blood. I lay less than a meter away from the captain. Sunlight still streamed in through the broken window, stretching my shadow long as well. I knew that as soon as the monster's next claw came down, I'd end up just like the captain. My thigh bone was already twisted. There was no way I could stand and run out of this room. I didn't look at the captain screaming, nor at Sam, who had stopped moving on the ground. My eyes were fixed on everything around me. The setting sun cast its light far, and every piece of rubble, every stone, every broken wall in the room left a dark shadow on the ground. As long as this light was here, our shadows would always be live targets for this monster. Suddenly, my gaze landed on an abandoned electrical box half a meter to my left. The box was half blown apart, its metal casing flipped outward. Inside the charred shell, several thick black heavy-duty cables as thick as a child's wrist were exposed. Following the cables upward, in the center of this abandoned store, a red emergency light hung from a swaying wire on the ceiling. The light, jostled by the building's tremors, was now swinging back and forth like a pendulum, clattering loudly. The light from this lamp is very bright. As it swings, it stretches and shrinks the already complex shadows in the room, making them lengthen and shorten. Every time the monster grabs someone by their shadow, it seems to adjust its limbs to the rhythm of the lamp swaying. Light. The key is in the light. Without the sunlight slanting in, without this swaying emergency lamp overhead, the room would be pitch black. If it became completely dark, there would be no outlines of shadows on the floor or walls. Without shadows, this monster that grabs shadows to snap human bones would be physically blind. My hands started frantically, groping through the pile of broken bricks beside me. My fingers hit sharp shards of glass, slicing open my palms. Sticky blood immediately welled up, but I couldn't care less. Finally, my right hand clamped onto something in the crevices of the bricks. It was the tactical knife Sam had dropped on the ground when he broke down. Though the tip was broken, the remaining half of the blade still glinted coldly in the blood-red sunlight. Using both arms to push myself up, I dragged my injured right leg across the ground, inch by inch, crawling toward the abandoned electrical distribution box. At that moment, the monster above let out another heavy, rasping breath. Its two green eyes, located below its chest, had turned and locked onto me. One of its thick black claws, covered in reverse joints, was raised high in the air, aimed directly at the shadow of my waist on the ground, and slammed down. The thick black claw, raised high, came crashing down. It carried a heavy, foul wind through the air, scattering the gray cement dust on the floor. I gripped the broken tactical knife with both hands and rolled hard to the left on the ground. Thud. A dull sound. The monster's claw landed squarely where I had been lying. More precisely, it struck the shadow of my waist left on the ground. At that instant, an indescribable, excruciating pain shot through my waist. It felt like an invisible, 100-pound iron hammer had smashed into my waist through the air. Under that blow, the hard plastic plate inside my bulletproof vest cracked with a sharp snap, the whole piece caving in and pressing against my ribs. The force of the impact sent my body sliding hard to the right across the ground. The broken brick scraped my elbows and cheeks, leaving them bloody. My right thigh bone, already misaligned, slammed into a concrete step nearby, causing tears to stream down my face and blur my vision. Using the momentum from that collision, I rolled right under the abandoned distribution box. The monster's massive body on the ceiling began to descend. Its dozen black limbs moved rapidly across the broken floor slabs, pressing down on countless rusted rebar hanging above, making them creak and groan. Its head, right in the middle of its chest, lowered, and its two green, dead fish eyes flickered in the dust-filled air, locked onto me under the box. At that moment, the emergency light above swung even more violently. The red light swept wildly across the concrete walls and floor. With each swing, my shadow behind the distribution box stretched into strange shapes. Ignoring the searing pain in my waist, I gripped the knife with both hands and stabbed forward. The blade plunged directly into the gap between the thick black power cables inside the box. The wires inside were stiff, like solid rubber rods. My palms were slick with blood from the cuts, making the handle slippery. Gritting my teeth, I used both hands to pull the broken blade downward. Zzz. Crack. A series of blinding blue sparks exploded inside the distribution box. The sparks blazed like a tiny sun, illuminating the dim store brighter than daylight. The copper wires inside the cables instantly melted under the high heat, emitting a pungent smell of burnt plastic. Because of this sudden burst of blinding blue light, my shadow on the wall instantly magnified dozens of times, becoming a massive black silhouette reaching the ceiling. The monster in midair seemed provoked by this suddenly enlarged shadow. It let out a coarse cry like a leaking old bellows, and its huge body lunged straight down from the ceiling. Boom! Its massive black physical form, weighing hundreds of pounds, slammed heavily onto the ground beside the electrical box. Under the force of the impact, the entire building shook, and a 2-finger-wide black crack split open in the concrete floor. Countless broken bricks and dust surged upward like a fountain, burying me completely in the debris. One of its reverse-jointed black claws swept through the blue electrical sparks, striking the enormous shadow on the wall that belonged to me. Once again, my chest felt as if struck by a heavy hammer. I spat out a mouthful of white foam, my body flying backward and sliding over 2 meters across the ground, before crashing hard into a broken concrete pillar. Red brick fragments rained down from the pillar, covering me entirely. At that moment, the captain's position shifted as well. Lying on the ground, he used his last intact right leg to desperately push against the floor. His hand groped until it found the last high-explosive grenade Sam had dropped in the pile of bricks. "Bastard! Over here!" The captain bit off the grenade's pin with his teeth, shouting as he mustered all his strength to hurl the grenade toward the monster's grotesque head protruding from its chest. The red grenade traced an arc through the air. The monster's 2 green eyes shifted, and one of its reverse-jointed black arms reached out, snatching the grenade from the air with uncanny precision. Its hand clenched tightly around the grenade, fingers digging inward. Boom! The high-explosive grenade detonated directly in the monster's black palm. A blazing red fireball instantly engulfed its entire right arm. The massive shockwave of the explosion reverberated through the narrow store, battering my eardrums until all I could hear was a deafening ring. Large sections of the concrete ceiling, shaken loose by the blast, collapsed in chunks, crashing to the ground with thunderous thuds. But the explosion didn't shatter the monster. Shrapnel struck its dead pork-like black skin, producing a dense series of thudding sounds. The hand that had gripped the grenade was indeed mangled, 3 reverse-jointed fingers dangling limply from the wrist. A torrent of black, waste oil-like mucus gushed from the wound, pouring onto the ground like water from an opened faucet. The black mucus splattered onto the scorching flames of the explosion, emitting a foul stench like burning rotten fish and shrimp. The intense light from the grenade blast stretched the shadows inside the abandoned store to their limits. Though injured, the monster used the brightness of the explosion to its advantage. Its remaining dozen or so black claws frantically slammed against the ground and walls. Thud, thud, thud. With each strike, the piles of rubble on the ground were pulverized into dust. Sam's shadow, lying in the corner, was swept by the monster's limbs in the flickering light. In reality, the bones in Sam's entire left shoulder shattered in an instant with a series of dense cracking sounds. His left arm went limp, and after a few convulsions on the ground, he was completely buried under a collapsed red brick wall, falling silent. The captain's left thigh shadow was pinned down once again by the monster. His real body began sliding backward across the ground toward the creature. His bulletproof vest had already been worn through by the rough floor, and the green camouflage uniform beneath it was torn to shreds. He gripped a protruding rusty steel rebar with both hands, the skin on his fingers scraping against it until they were bloody, leaving 10 crimson marks. "Run! Smash the light!" The captain shouted with his last ounce of strength, clinging desperately to the rebar. His body was caught between 2 immense opposing forces. The fabric at his waist stretched to its limit, and the bones in his spine emitted terrifying cracking sounds, as if being forcibly pulled apart. I lay behind the broken concrete pillar, my ears filled with a ringing noise. My right leg was completely useless, so I could only crawl forward inch by inch with my arms across the dust and black mucus-covered ground. The broken knife in my hand was gone, lost somewhere. My fingers scrabbled across the floor until they struck a large chunk of fallen concrete, about the size of a child's head, with a piece of rusty, sharp wire still attached. I looked up at the red emergency light, still swinging wildly overhead. The light had just swung directly above me. Its bulb, damaged from the earlier short circuit, sizzled and flickered, the red glow waxing and waning. Gritting my teeth, I wrapped both arms around the heavy concrete chunk. Using the last surge of numbness from the blow to my waist, I heaved it upward with all my might. "Go to hell!" I roared, hurling the concrete chunk with the attached wire toward the emergency light above me. The heavy concrete block flew through the air, its rusted wire flashing briefly in the red light. Crack! A crisp sound of shattering glass. The concrete block struck the red emergency light squarely. The bulb inside shattered instantly, its tungsten filament bursting into a small white spark before going completely dark. At that exact moment, the sun outside sank fully below the horizon. The slanting, blood-red sunlight that had been streaming through the window vanished in a tenth of a second. With no sunlight from outside and no emergency light overhead, the entire abandoned store was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness in an instant. It was a darkness so profound, it felt as if someone had pressed a thick black cloth tightly over both eyes. In that moment, all the black shadows cast by light on the ground, and walls disappeared entirely in a physical sense. The terrifying pulling force around me vanished abruptly at the same instant the darkness fell. My tightly tensed lower back and right thigh suddenly relaxed. I lay sprawled on the cold, damp soil and dust, gasping for breath. In the darkness, the enormous monster lost all traces of its target. It had become completely blind. I heard it let out an enraged, guttural roar less than a meter away from me. Its dozen or so black, rebar-like limbs, now directionless in the dark, began flailing wildly through the air and the surrounding rubble. Its massive claws struck the hard concrete floor, sending shattered stones flying like shrapnel in all directions. One sharp fragment grazed my ear, slicing open my earlobe. Warm blood trickled down my neck. I lay on the ground, holding my breath completely. I could even smell the black, oily mucus dripping from the monster's body, falling drop by drop onto the concrete floor just centimeters from my cheek, sizzling as it corroded the surface. Its heavy body slowly turned in the darkness, every grating sound of its bone joints clearly audible to me. It thrashed blindly for several minutes, reducing the remaining structural debris around it to collapsing heaps. Finally, accompanied by the sticky, dragging sound of something heavy moving across the ground, the noise began to recede step by step toward the depths of the alley toward the direction of the rusted basement iron door. The basement door slammed shut with a bang, and the alley fell into deathly silence once more. I lay in the darkness for a long time, until a heavy armored vehicle from the base rumbled into the street. The vehicle's massive spotlight flicked on, flooding the entire abandoned store with a stark white light. Medics armed with rifles rushed in. They lifted me onto a stretcher and carried me to the vehicle. Lying on the stretcher, I looked down at my right thigh. My camouflage pants had been burned away by the black mucus on the ground, exposing my completely deformed right leg joint. My kneecap was twisted to the outside of my body, the bone beneath pushing the skin into a hard, protruding lump. The medics clamped a rigid plastic splint tightly around my leg, wrapping it layer after layer with tape. The captain was also carried aboard. His hands were covered in blood, one of his fingernails missing, and he was gulping down cold water from a thermos. As for Sam and Pete, they weren't brought onto the vehicle. The medics later packed some deformed helmets and shattered ballistic plates they'd found in the rubble into black bags. The armored vehicle's rear iron door slammed shut with a bang. A small green emergency fluorescent light hung from the ceiling of the compartment. It swayed gently back and forth overhead as the vehicle moved. I sat on the bench, looking down at my feet. Because of the green fluorescent light above, my boots cast a faint, greenish shadow on the vehicle's anti-slip iron floor. The vehicle hit a large rock, jolting violently upward. My real foot lifted slightly with the motion of my body, but the faint shadow of my foot on the iron floor. Only after the vehicle settled, and my real foot had already returned to the ground did it slowly, ever so slowly, shift 1 centimeter to the side on the cold iron surface.